What happens when royal privilege collides with Hollywood's most unfiltered voice? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Bill Maher for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. What started as a standard celebrity appearance quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history, leaving viewers stunned and social media ablaze with controversy. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouse personalities clash in ways nobody saw coming. The atmosphere in the real-time studio was electric as Prince Harry walked onto the set, his usual composed demeanor masking what would soon become an evening of unprecedented drama. Maher, known for his razor-sharp wit and willingness to tackle controversial subjects, had been promoting this interview for weeks as a no-holds-barred conversation with one of the world's most talked-about royals. As the cameras rolled, Maher wasted no time diving into territory that immediately put his guest on edge. "So, Harry, let's talk about your latest venture." Maher began with his characteristic smirk. "Another Netflix documentary, another book deal, another tell-all interview. At what point do you think the American public might get tired of hearing about how tough it is to be a millionaire prince?" Harry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his media-trained composure. "Bill, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what we're trying to accomplish. This isn't about complaining or seeking sympathy. It's about using our platform to highlight important issues that affect real people." Right. Maher interrupted, leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated nod. "Because nothing says man of the people like a guy who's never worked a real job in his life lecturing Americans about inequality from his 16-bathroom mansion in Montecito." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably as the tension became palpable. Harry's media handlers, visible just off camera, exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the friendly promotional chat they had negotiated. "I served my country for 10 years in the military," Harry shot back, his voice carrying a slight edge. "I've seen real hardship, real sacrifice. And I've used my experiences to try to make a difference, whether that's through Invictus Games for wounded veterans or mental health advocacy." Maher waved dismissively. "Oh, the military service. Yes, let's talk about that. You know what's interesting to me? You served in Afghanistan, right? But somehow you've managed to turn even that into a Netflix series. Tell me, when you were over there, were you thinking about the streaming rights?" The color drained from Harry's face. "That's completely out of line, Bill. The men and women I served with, the people who didn't make it home, you don't get to trivialize their sacrifice for a cheap laugh." "I'm not trivializing anything," Maher replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. "I'm questioning the authenticity of someone who claims to want privacy while simultaneously putting every detail of his life on display for profit. You left the royal family because you wanted out of the spotlight, but you've done nothing but chase that spotlight ever since." The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras. Harry gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "You have no idea what you're talking about. The decision to step back from royal duties wasn't about wanting privacy. It was about protecting my family from a toxic system that you clearly don't understand." "Protecting your family?" Maher laughed bitterly. "By dragging them through the mud on international television? By writing books that expose private conversations? That's protection? Come on, Harry. At least own what you're doing instead of pretending it's some noble cause." The audience began to murmur, sensing the interview was spiraling beyond normal television tension. Harry's publicist stood up from her seat in the front row, her phone already in hand, likely texting frantically with damage control instructions. "You know what your problem is, Bill," Harry said, his voice now carrying unmistakable anger. "You think because you've built a career on cynicism and cheap shots, everyone else must be operating from the same place. Some of us actually believe in trying to make the world better." Maher's eyes lit up with predatory glee. There it is, the righteous indignation. The "I'm better than you" attitude that Americans just love from their former colonizers. "Tell me something, Your Highness," and I use that title ironically. "When was the last time you actually did something that helped someone without a camera crew following you around?" The insult hung in the air like a physical presence. Harry's training in royal protocol warred visibly with his desire to respond in kind. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the deliberate provocation. You want to know what I find fascinating about this whole thing? Maher continued, sensing his advantage in pressing forward. You left England claiming the press was too intrusive, too hostile. But here you are, sitting across from me, getting grilled by someone who's probably being tougher on you than any British journalist ever was. The difference is, I'm not being paid by your family's taxpayers to be polite about it. Harry's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the studio's acoustics. You're enjoying this, aren't you? The opportunity to tear down someone who's trying to do good work. Is this what passes for journalism in America? Personal attacks disguised as interview questions. This isn't journalism, Harry. This is television. And you know what good television requires? Truth. Authentic moments. Not the carefully scripted, media-trained responses you've been giving me since you sat down. Maher leaned forward, his voice taking on a more confrontational edge. So here's your chance for an authentic moment. Stop hiding behind your talking points and tell me, in America, why we should care about the opinions of someone who's never had to worry about paying rent, never had to choose between groceries and medicine, never had to live in the real world that the rest of us inhabit. The question hit its mark. Harry's composed facade began to crack, his breathing becoming more visible, his posture shifting from diplomatic to defensive. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every sign that the interview was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. What neither man realized in that moment was that their verbal sparring match was about to escalate into something far more explosive than either had anticipated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would dominate headlines and social media for days to come. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Harry processed Maher's challenge, his jaw working as he fought to maintain the diplomatic training that had been drilled into him since childhood. But something in the host's smug expression seemed to trigger a breaking point that years of royal protocol couldn't contain. You want authentic, Harry said, his voice cutting through the studio's tension. Like a blade. Here's authentic for you, Bill. You sit here every week pretending to be some kind of truth teller, some fearless voice of reason. But what you really are is a bitter old man who gets his kicks from tearing down people who actually try to make a difference in the world. The studio erupted in shocked murmurs. Maher's eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting such a direct counterattack. Oh, now we're getting somewhere, he said, but his voice carried a note of genuine surprise. The prince has some fight in him after all. Don't patronize me, Harry snapped, leaning forward in his chair. You think because you've been doing this show for 20 years, you've earned the right to lecture me about authenticity? When's the last time you put yourself on the line for something bigger than your own ego? When's the last time you risked anything that actually mattered? Maher's expression hardened, the entertainer's mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. I risk my career every single week by telling uncomfortable truths that people like you don't want to hear. I've been canceled, protested, boycotted, and threatened for speaking my mind. What have you risked, Harry? Your allowance. My allowance. Harry's voice rose, causing the sound engineers to adjust their levels frantically. I risked my life in Afghanistan while you were sitting safely in your Hollywood bubble, making jokes about things you've never experienced. I risked my relationship with my family to protect my wife and children from the same forces that killed my mother. I've risked everything that was familiar and comfortable to try to build something meaningful. Your mother, Maher repeated, seizing on the reference with predatory precision. There it is. The trump card. The ultimate conversation ender. Tell me, Harry, how long are you going to keep using Diana's death as a shield against legitimate criticism? How long are you going to hide behind that tragedy instead of taking responsibility for your own choices? The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, sensing they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal television drama. Harry's face went white, then red, his hands gripping the chair arms so tightly his knuckles cracked audibly. You just crossed a line you can never uncross, Harry said, his voice barely controlled. You want to attack me? Fine. You want to question my motives? Go ahead. But you don't get to weaponize my mother's death for your entertainment. You don't get to use her memory as a punchline. Maher seemed to realize he had overstepped, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. I'm not using her as a punchline. I'm pointing out that you use her as an excuse. Every time someone questions your behavior, every time someone challenges your narrative, You invoke Diana. It's emotional manipulation, and frankly, it's beneath someone who claims to be fighting for truth and transparency. Emotional manipulation? Harry stood up abruptly, towering over the seated host. You want to talk about manipulation? What do you call this? What do you call ambushing a guest with personal attacks disguised as interview questions? What do you call dragging someone's dead mother into your petty grievances? The audience began to shift restlessly, some standing to get a better view of the unprecedented confrontation. Security personnel moved closer to the set, their hands hovering near their radios. The show's producers huddled frantically behind the cameras, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the drama continue. Sit down, Harry, Maher said, his voice carrying a warning tone. You're making a scene. I'm making a scene. Harry laughed bitterly, but remained standing. You've spent the last 15 minutes trying to humiliate me on national television, and I'm making a scene? You invited me here under false pretenses, promised a respectful conversation about my work, and instead you've turned it into a character assassination. And now you're concerned about decorum? Maher's face flushed red. I promised you a conversation, not a puff piece. If you can't handle basic questions about your public behavior, maybe you shouldn't be seeking public platforms. Maybe you should. Go back to your mansion and count your Netflix money instead of lecturing the rest of us about service and sacrifice. Basic questions? Harry's voice cracked with fury. You've questioned my military service, my marriage, my family, my mother's death, and my character. In what world are those basic questions? In what universe is that professional journalism? In the universe where actions have consequences and public figures are held accountable for their choices. Maher shot back, standing up to match Harry's posture. You can't have it both ways, Harry. You can't court publicity when it serves your interests and then cry foul when that same publicity turns critical. You can't profit from your royal status while simultaneously playing the victim of that same system. The two men now stood facing each other across the interview table, their confrontation having evolved far beyond anything resembling a typical late-night television segment. The tension was so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. You know what your real problem is, Bill, Harry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. You're jealous. You're a 70-year-old man who's spent his entire career commenting on other people's lives because you've never had the courage to actually live your own. You hide behind comedy and cynicism because genuine emotion, genuine commitment, genuine sacrifice, those things terrify you. Maher's face contorted with rage. Jealous? Of what? Of a spoiled brat who's never worked a day in his life? Of someone who abandoned his duty and his country for a Hollywood lifestyle? Of a man who betrays his own family for money and attention? You think I'm jealous of that pathetic existence? The insult hung in the air like a physical blow. Harry's breathing became labored, his face cycling through expressions of shock, hurt, and building fury. The cameras captured every moment of his emotional journey, broadcasting his raw vulnerability to millions of viewers who were witnessing what would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. But as explosive as the confrontation had already become, neither man seemed prepared for how much further it was about to escalate, setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion that would leave the entire entertainment industry reeling. Harry's face had gone from red to almost purple, his breathing shallow and rapid. The careful composure that had defined his public persona for decades was completely shattered, replaced by raw, unfiltered rage. When he spoke again, his voice carried a venom that made the entire studio recoil. Pathetic existence, Harry repeated, his words dripping with contempt. Let me tell you what's pathetic, Bill. What's pathetic is a man who's built his entire career on mocking others because he's too cowardly to examine his own failures. What's pathetic is someone who's so desperate for relevance that he'll attack a grieving son's relationship with his dead mother for applause. What's pathetic is a bitter, lonely old man who mistakes cruelty for wit and thinks his emptiness gives him the right to judge others. Maher's face went ashen, then flushed dark red. How dare you? No, how dare you? Harry exploded, his voice echoing through the studio with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. You sit there in your privileged bubble, never having served anyone but yourself, never having sacrificed anything for a cause greater than your own ego. and you have the audacity to question my commitment to service? You've never put your life on the line for anything. You've never given up everything you knew to protect the people you love. You're nothing but a professional critic, a parasite who feeds off other people's real experiences. The host's composure finally cracked completely. A parasite? You're calling me a parasite? You're a man who's lived off taxpayer money his entire life, who inherited wealth and privilege you never earned, who turned his back on his own family and country for Hollywood money. And you're calling me a parasite? At least I'm honest about my privileged background, Harry shot back. At least I'm trying to use that privilege for something meaningful instead of just tearing others down for sport. What do you contribute to the world besides negativity and division? What legacy are you leaving behind besides a trail of people you've hurt for entertainment? Maher stood up straighter, his hands shaking with rage. My legacy? I've spent decades fighting against hypocrisy, against people who think their status makes them above criticism. I've challenged politicians, celebrities, and yes, even royalty, when they needed to be challenged. That's my legacy, holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Holding people accountable. Harry laughed bitterly. Is that what you call character assassination? Is that what you call exploiting personal tragedy for ratings? You're not a journalist, Bill. You're not even a comedian. You're just a bully with a platform, and tonight you picked the wrong target. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Several audience members were already heading for the exits, uncomfortable with the level of hostility they were witnessing. The show's producers were gesturing frantically from behind the cameras, but neither man seemed aware of anything beyond their mutual animosity. Wrong target. Maher's voice rose to match Harry's volume. You think your title protects you? You think your tragic backstory makes you immune to criticism? You came to America thinking you could reinvent yourself as some kind of social justice warrior, but all you've done is prove that you're the same entitled prince you always were. The only difference is now you're entitled and sanctimonious. That final insult seemed to break something fundamental in Harry. His entire body went rigid, his face contorting with an emotion so intense it was almost frightening to witness. When he spoke, his voice was barely human, more growl than speech. You want to see entitled? You want to see sanctimonious? Let me show you what 20 years of dealing with people exactly like you has taught me. Harry stepped closer to Maher, close enough that the host instinctively took a step back. You think you're brave because you attack people from behind. A desk, surrounded by your staff and your audience of sycophants. But you're the biggest coward I've ever met. You're so terrified of genuine human connection, so afraid of showing any real vulnerability, that you've built your entire identity around tearing others down. You don't know anything about me, Maher snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I know everything about you, Harry replied, his voice now deadly calm. You're the same as every other bitter critic who's ever hidden behind a microphone or a camera. You're the same as every tabloid journalist who ever stalked my mother. You're the same as every politician who's ever used someone else's pain for their own gain. You're all the same. Empty, hollow people who think destroying others will somehow fill the void where your soul should be. The comparison to the tabloid journalist who had hounded Diana seemed to hit Maher like a physical blow. His face went white, then red again, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a response. That's enough, he finally managed. This interview is over. Security, escort Mr. Mountbatten-Windsor from the building. Harry let out a harsh laugh. Oh, now you want to end it? Now that you've shown everyone exactly who you really are? Now that you've revealed yourself to be nothing more than a sad, aging bully who gets his kicks from hurting people? He looked directly into the main camera, addressing the audience at home. This is who Bill Maher really is, folks. This is the man you've been watching and admiring. A coward who attacks grieving sons and thinks it makes him brave. Security personnel were now moving onto the set, but Harry wasn't finished. You know what the real tragedy is, Bill? You had a chance tonight to have a real conversation with someone who's actually trying to make a difference in the world. You could have learned something. You could have found some common ground. But instead, you chose to reveal yourself as exactly the kind of person who makes the world a worse place. Get him out of here, Maher shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Get him out now. But Harry was already moving, removing his microphone and throwing it onto the interview table with such force that it bounced and clattered to the floor. I'm leaving, he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the studio despite the chaos. "Not because you're throwing me out, but because I refuse to give you another second of my time. This is exactly why I left England, to get away from people like you who think cruelty is entertainment." As he strode toward the exit, Harry turned back one final time. "You asked me earlier when I was going to stop using my mother's death as a shield. Here's a better question. When are you going to stop using other people's pain as a weapon? When are you going to find something better to do with your life than hurt people for applause?" The studio fell completely silent except for the sound of Harry's footsteps echoing as he walked off the set. Maher stood frozen behind his desk, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: rage, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. The audience sat in stunned silence, uncertain whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. For several long moments, no one moved. The cameras continued rolling, capturing Maher's obvious struggle to regain his composure. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Well," he said, attempting his trademark smirk, but failing miserably. "I guess that's how you handle accountability when you're used to everyone bowing and scraping." But the words rang hollow, his usual confidence completely shattered. The show's producers quickly cut to commercial, but the damage was done. In the space of 30 minutes, both men had revealed sides of themselves that their carefully crafted public personas had long concealed. The confrontation had gone far beyond typical television drama, becoming something raw and deeply personal that left everyone who witnessed it feeling like they had seen too much. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out in uncomfortable silence, it was clear that this wasn't just the end of an interview. It was the end of something much bigger. The explosive confrontation between Prince Harry and Bill Maher had become the kind of television moment that would be analyzed, debated, and remembered for years to come, a perfect storm of ego, privilege, and human frailty that had played out in the most public way possible.